Mr Speaker, the budget that was brought down on Tuesday night, the 1992-93 budget, is already dead in the water. Yeah. It's been discredited in record time. We should never forget that John Kerrin was sacked for bringing in a better budget than this one. Why is it dead? Firstly, it's dead because of its dishonesty. It's failed to honestly assess the state of our nation, the magnitude of our problems, and to deliver policy solutions to deal with those problems. Secondly, it's dead because it's been almost universally canned by every major commentator in Australia. Thirdly, it's dead because the Treasurer himself has undermined his own budget. There's a $50 billion accumulation of deficits that is unfunded. He came here the other night with a secret tax agenda. And we all know on this side of the Parliament that the only difference between you and us in terms of the funding of the package is that we are honest enough to say we're going to have a GST, you've put yours in the bottom drawer and you're going to pull it out after the next election. Which of course you have absolutely no hope of winning.
Order.
You are short $50 billion, but for you the GST will be an additional tax. Not part of a tax reform package, not part of a package that abolishes 7 taxes. It will just be yet another increase in the tax burden on average Australians. The budget's also dead because the Treasurer's undermined the Medicare. He's undermined the Medicare elements of the budget. He said that the increase in the levy won't go ahead unless you get state agreement. That means there won't be any marginal adjustment to the hospital system under this government unless the states get agreement. And of course, the unions have been given a veto power over the whole thing, and we're yet to know whether in fact they'll give it a tick in the box. Finally, it's dead because the Minister for Local Government made a pretty amateurish attempt at pork barrelling. If you want to go into pork barrelling, you should leave it to the Prime Minister. A very amateurish attempt to try and buy votes, which is blown up in your face when your numbers didn't add up. It was supposed to be a traditional Labor budget. But the longest-serving Labor Prime Minister in this country, Bob Hawke, your predecessor, has also canned the budget. He's also canned it. He's questioned its credibility and your credibility, and he's talked about the tax. He's talked about the tax that's hanging over the budget and its credibility. It is an economic document, of course. The budget's dead in the water because it does not deal with the problems of this country. And I've heard the Prime Minister on many occasions over the years say that in this country our economic problems are that we spend too much, we produce too little, we save too little, and we have too much debt. And what does the budget do? It spends more, does nothing about production, gives us an all-time low savings rate, and debt skyrockets as a result of this budget and its effect on the economy over the rest of this decade. It does not solve our economic problems, it only services them. It doesn't create real jobs, it just hides people off the unemployment queues. And there are plenty of examples you can give as to how this budget doesn't do the job in economic terms. These job subsidies and these madcap job creation schemes and so on just don't work. They don't create jobs, they put people, sure they give them shovels and they line them up to local councils and so on, but those jobs stop and the shovels disappear when the money stops. They're not real jobs, they're Mickey Mouse jobs. And your training scheme, you're going to have people trained all right, you've got no link to the workplace, you train people and you'll end up with the best trained and best educated dole queues in the world. Doesn't solve the problem, hides people off the unemployment roll in training scheme. And these subsidies to some of your mates in the business community, you help them live with the inefficiencies of their operations rather than lowering their business costs so they can be internationally competitive and internationally efficient. Doesn't solve the problem. Your infrastructure spending, the money you put into railways, for example, will have nice glossy rail lines all around Australia. But unless you do something fundamental about the work practices and the poor management and the government ownership and mismanagement of the railways, you'll only have shiny railway tracks, all right, on which you can lose money and probably lose it faster. And of course, you're putting money into government buildings. We've got a glut of office space in Australia, and these guys are going into the property market. They don't deal with the problems. They don't deal with the problems. They service the problems. They only service the problem. And finally, of course, it was supposed to be a shrewd political document. was supposed to neutralise Fightback, or at least pinch the bits of Fightback you would like to have on your side. It was supposed to buy votes in key marginal seats, and it was supposed to buy off vested interests. And I noticed from the reaction of a lot of those so-called vested interests that have canned you, it's a political failure as well. It's not about job creation, this budget. It's about vote creation. And it's about vote creation by spending money you don't have to buy those votes. It's not a budget that is going to bring home our bacon. It's simply a budget that was designed to save Paul Keating's bacon. It's not a document for the future, Mr. Speaker. It's a document by a government that has no future. And I'd suggest, Mr. Speaker, that tonight we don't spend any more time on this budget. Let's not spend any more time on a failed budget. Let's not spend any more time on a failed government. Let's talk about the future of our great nation. I challenge the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, who are of a similar age to myself, to think back to the period when they were growing up, to think back to some of the circumstances that existed, what our hopes and what our aspirations were in this country. And I would put it to you that you would never have contemplated the possibility that we would have 1 million Australians unemployed. You would not have contemplated the possibility in particular that a so-called Labor government had created that 1 million unemployed. You would never have contemplated the possibility that this nation could be almost $200 billion in debt, and perhaps under the sort of policies we've seen it'll go to $400 billion in the course of the decade. You would never have contemplated a situation where hospital queues are getting longer, where 50 or 60,000 kids couldn't get into university this year, when all the opportunities that we had when we were leaving school, the job opportunities that were there, the education opportunities that were there. You would never have contemplated the possibility that millions and millions of Australians would actually feel strangers in their own country, would actually feel excluded, would actually feel that they'd been thrown outside the system in their own country. But that is how millions and millions of Australians feel today in the circumstances of the worst recession in 60 years. And who would have thought in those days that when we grew up and had children that we would be looking down the gun barrel of leaving our children a lower standard of living than we would enjoy ourselves. And that is the bottom line of the sort of policies that you've run. Also, of course, if you'd suggested to me, Prime Minister, in those days that countries like Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, even Japan could have outperformed us significantly in the course of the period we were growing up and in fact ultimately match our living standards, I would have thought you're out of your tree. I would have genuinely thought you're out of your tree to make that sort of suggestion. Yet, Japan was 2/3 of our standard of living in 1970. They passed us in 1980, and now we are less than 2/3 of their standard of living in 1990. And of course, Hong Kong and Singapore and Taiwan, places that don't have a lot of natural advantages in an economic sense, are about to match our standard of living in the course of this decade. Now, you wouldn't have contemplated that, and neither would have I, but that is where this country is at the present time. And I think it's important that we stop and ask ourselves, why has this happened? Why is it that a country that is so well placed, that is so uniquely placed, with such an abundance of natural resources and so many opportunities, has absolutely squandered those opportunities in the course of the current generation? And I think the principal difference, and this highlights the principal difference between you and ourselves, is the increasing role of government and the influence of government in this country over that period. I personally date it with the early 1970s and the arrival of Gough Whitlam. And I thought it was particularly pertinent that the comparison that was made by Max Walsh between the final days of the Whitlam government and the final days of the Keating government was a particularly appropriate one in the current circumstances. But it's the role and influence of government. Government and bureaucracies have got bigger and bigger over this period. They got more intrusive, they got more regulatory. There's more participation in business, more control over the lives of average Australians, and that, more than anything else, has had the fundamental effects that we're observing in our economy today. It's certainly squeezed out the private sector and eliminated, or significantly reduced, I should say, the private sector's capacity to create wealth and jobs. And see, we believe that the private sector is the essential mechanism by which jobs are created in this country. Real jobs and real wealth is created in the private sector, and the continual growth of government, the squeezing of government, the suffocation of government is what has driven the private sector backwards and is destroying its capacity to create wealth and to create jobs. And of course it's squashed individual incentive. This role of the pervasiveness of government has squashed individual incentive, it's restricted individual freedoms, it's restricted the individual capacity for choice.
Order.
And you just think about how tough it's become to go and start a business, for example. The dozens and dozens of approvals and licences and forms have got to be dealt with in order to get a business underway. It's the stifling effect of increasing government and increasing government regulation that's done the job. And of course, if we look at some other effects of this role and the size and influence of government, I guess one of the most disturbing is the increased dependence that has emerged on government. Welfare dependency today is roughly double what it was in the early 1970s in Australia. Nearly 4 million Australians are on some form of welfare assistance at the present time, as recent newspaper headlines have documented. A major impact in terms of dependency, but not just in terms of individuals, also in terms of business. You've built an incestuous climate now where favoured ones come in and look for favoured treatment. And one businessman comes in and says, he got a tariff, I want a tariff. He got a quota, I want a quota. He got a subsidy, I want a subsidy. That's the nature of the economy and the economic system that you've built by increasingly consolidating and intensifying the impact of government. And I guess perhaps most disturbingly, it has had a very significant effect on our attitudes, because people are constantly being led to accept less than the best. All your documents, all your budget papers compared our performance to the past. You didn't compare our performance to any significant extent to some of those countries that have outperformed us. No, you rationalise it relative to the past. Our waterfront is getting better because it's less efficient than it was last year. Still might be about 150% short of best international practice. That doesn't matter. It's getting better. You rationalise second best performance. You rationalise second best performance, which has had a very significant effect, very significant effect on basic attitudes and values in this country. Could you imagine Alan Border coming back from a cricket series and saying, well, guys, I lost the Ashes, but we scored more runs than we did the time before? That's the type of rationalisation. That's the type of rationalisation we had from you guys about our recent economic performance in the course of the budget papers. So we come to the fundamental difference between you and us. We believe that real wealth and real jobs is created through the private sector. It is not created by building another bureaucracy. It's not created by spending money, as you did in this budget, that you don't have. Because ultimately that money's got to be paid for. Ultimately that expenditure's got to be funded. And that can have a very significant effect on the total supply of jobs and wealth in this country. So the key difference between you and us is that we believe in the private sector, we believe in individual Australians, we believe in the forces of the market and the forces of competition, and you believe in the big brother, the big government, the big overbearing, suffocating government that is supposed to bring all the answers. If you don't want to believe me, you go through the budget document and count the number of times you said that the government was going to create jobs. You don't create jobs, you just hide unemployment. So that is why Fightback puts its emphasis on average Australians. Australians, we believe, are able to match and are able to beat the best in the world. We certainly do it in sport, as we saw in recent days in the Olympics. Why aren't we doing it in terms of our economic and business performance? Australians have always been better than their governments. We have never had the government we deserve in this country. And that is what Fightback is all about, setting a government framework that provides the mechanism whereby the private sector can carry the main task at what it's good at what it only can do, which is generating wealth and generating jobs. And secondly, of course, the government has to take care of the genuinely needy. And one of the great tragedies of the sort of mentality that you guys develop is that you keep shrinking the size of the economic cake and you fight about the distribution of that cake, when what you should be doing is thinking about building a bigger cake so that everybody can have more. No, you reduce everyone to the lowest common denominator. Government suffocates the process. Private sector's driven out backwards. The jobs are permanently lost, and we're left with major social and economic trauma in this country. So Fightback seeks to reverse that process, to put its faith back in individual Australians, to give individual Australians choice, to give them the opportunity to get greater control over their lives. Less government and more focus on business, cutting business costs, giving business the scope to get out and do what only they can do, which is create wealth and create jobs by matching the best in the world. As I said, the government does have a responsibility to look after the disadvantaged. We take that very seriously. We do it in a way that targets that money very effectively, and we set out to increase the assistance given to those who are genuinely disadvantaged while creating the circumstances where people can actually get out there and get a job and generate wealth and rebuild this country to the potential that we all know that it really has. So Fightback is an integrated, it's the most honest document that's ever been brought into the political process in Australia. It honestly addresses our problems in this country, and it provides realistic solutions. It doesn't service the problem like you guys, it actually solves the problem, which is fundamentally important in the circumstances that we find us about to leave a lower standard of living to our children than we've enjoyed ourselves. The focus is on job creation, the focus is on debt reduction, the focus is on generating wealth, in generating national saving, as I say, solutions, not just servicing the problem. The centrepiece of Fightback is, of course, industrial relations reform. And I notice the way in which you've started to use our words, enterprise bargaining, but you have no idea what enterprise bargaining really means. You are so paranoid about your electoral chances that you've taken our words, but you don't take our substance. The very essence of Fightback, as I say, is individual, giving individuals choice, giving them capacity to influence their own lives. So when you go to the workplace, individuals want the right to talk to their employers directly if they wish, or to join a union if they wish. And equally, employers want the right to be able to talk to their employees directly without the presence of the union if they choose. It's an issue of choice. Workers also should be given the opportunity to negotiate all the terms and conditions of their employment above certain minima. We'll make sure they're not exploited, but above the minimum they should have the capacity, to negotiate with their employer. And you know, people as I go around Australia can't understand why some of these events that have occurred in recent days have been allowed to take place. For example, in the Pilbara, one fellow doesn't want to join a union, so we lose about $50 or $60 million worth of exports simply because one person didn't want to join a union. You go down to Burnie in Tasmania, where people actually wanted to cross the picket line and go to work, and they were prevented from doing that under the circumstances of that dispute, which you whipped up to a substantial extent to try and score cheap political points. And what about the shearer in Queensland who wanted to work on a Sunday and wasn't allowed? What's wrong with 7 days a week, 365 days a year in this country? And what about the workers at SPC? What about the workers at SPC who wanted the right to negotiate to save their job? And they were heavied and muscled by Halfpenny and others from Trade Hall Council in Victoria to try and constrain their opportunities. Fightback gives those people choice, it gives them greater control over their lives, it gives them the right to be a member of a union or not to be a member of a union, and it gives you wage outcomes that are internationally competitive. It gives the individuals a chance to earn more. As they lift their game, they earn more, they take home more, and there are plenty of examples around the world where people earn a lot more because they are productive and they've improved the quality of their performance. Similarly, rigidities in the current wage system exclude some people from a job, and young people, most importantly, are given no choice under your type of system. You've eliminated the gap between youth wages and adult wages in many cases, or you've narrowed the gap, which discriminates these young kids out of the workplace. It's about time we have a genuine minimum youth training wage that gives them the chance to get a job, gives them the chance to get a start in life, gives them a chance to actually get their foot on the first rung of what can be a career. Presently, your system discriminates against those kids. The industrial relations reform is, of course, importantly backed up by tax reform. The tax reform that is essential to actually give individuals more money back in their pocket, more return for their effort, a greater incentive to actually work harder, to work overtime, to take a promotion, to lift their game, to educate and to get additional education, training, whatever. They have the incentive under a tax system that has substantially lower tax rates. In this country, the marginal tax rates have doubled in terms of the average income earner in the last 20 or 30 years, And so very high income tax rates, about nearly 40 cents in the dollar, cut in at incomes about $21,000, well below average earnings in Australia. And people say to me, why don't we have a Hong Kong tax system? We'll fight back, we'll give it to you. At average income of $25,000 a year, you'll pay 14 cents in the dollar tax, you'll keep 86 cents in your pocket. So people will have the opportunity to decide when they buy, how much tax they pay by what they buy. And the GST fundamentally facilitates the abolition of 7 other taxes, which is very important from the point of view of jobs like payroll tax. The Prime Minister himself said the abolition of payroll tax would create 200,000 jobs. Why don't you do that? We're doing it, used to be part of your platform, because there's a very significant reduction in business costs which allows them to employ significantly more people. Similarly, we've got to attack infrastructure costs, and the 20 to 50% cost disadvantage in the waterfront or in shipping or in domestic transportation can be eliminated. You can laugh, Ralph Willis, you can laugh, but I don't see any excuse for why we don't have the best ports in the world, or the best rail system in the world, or the best road transport system in the world, or the best coastal ship. I can see he's starting to agree with me. I'm actually convincing him. In education, we've got to re-establish choice. We've got to start funding individuals rather than institutions. We've got to build competition between institutions, and we've got to re-establish things like excellence. Remember that word, Kim Beazley? Excellence. That's what the system ought to be based on. Excellence and merit. In the hospital system, you've got to deal with the problems of over-servicing, not tinker with them, and probably not do anything. You've had about 3 goes at trying to patch up Medicare, and your whip up there has got a proposal to nationalise the whole health system. In savings and superannuation, you've got to give tax incentives so people have the choice. Your answer on training is compulsion. Your answer on super is compulsion. Ours is to give people the tax incentives so that they get the choice. They can decide how much they save. They have a strong incentive to save and to prepare for their retirement. And of course, Fightback goes through a host of other areas, including things like immigration, which should be dramatically cut, more significantly cut than you've had. Doesn't do the migrants any good to have 40% of them on an unemployment benefit or some other government benefit 12 months after they've arrived. A significant cut in immigration is an essential part of the problem. I think we should hold immigration down until the labour market makes a significant recovery. And of course it's got to be a very significant role for the funding role should be very important.
There's far too much noise.
Very significant role. There's a very significant role, of course, for cuts in expenditure as part of that package, and making sure you target the expenditure to those most in need. Double family allowances to the low income levels, but as you go up the income scale and you get substantial income tax cuts, you should take greater financial responsibility for yourself and your family. Target it to the needy, make sure they get more, and as you go up the income scale, make sure that you pull those benefits back so that they are in a position to take care of the costs of education, or the costs of health care or whatever. A fundamental difference between us and the government. Fundamental difference. For far too long, Mr. Speaker, we've kidded ourselves in this country that you can tax people to the hilt without destroying the incentive. For far too long we've kidded ourselves that you can grant everyone the same wage rise without destroying initiative. For far too long we've kidded ourselves in this country that you can throw government money at every single social problem without destroying self-help and without destroying self-respect. For far too long in this country we've kidded ourselves that you can load business with red tape, green tape, black tape, and a host of cost disadvantages without destroying national wealth. And perhaps most importantly to a lot of Australians, for far too long we've kidded ourselves that you can constantly knock your country and denigrate your flag without destroying national pride. Without destroying national pride. Your concept of compassion is you should listen to this because it's very important. Very important. Your concept of compassion is to compensate people who you have denied choice, you have denied freedom, to whom you have denied opportunity as a result of your policies. That's your idea of compassion. I remember you saying not long ago, when they fall off the pace, you'll reach back and pull them up. What you mean is you pull everyone else down to the lowest common denominator. You try to compensate them for what you never gave them. Where genuine compassion is giving them a job rather than a welfare check, giving them an opportunity, giving them greater control over their lives. And I think it's very important, Prime Minister, that we try tonight, in the final minutes that I've got, to try and get you to focus on the magnitude of the problem in this country. And might I suggest to you that you, I suggest to me that you and the Treasurer and myself go down to Melbourne and we take each of the unemployed and we link them arm by arm from Melbourne up the Hume Highway all the way right through. How far do you think that line would go if we linked all the unemployed from Melbourne? We'd go right up across the Victorian border, right through the very heart of the seat of Blaxland. Heard of that? Been there lately? Right through the heart of the seat of Blaxland, through the city of Sydney, almost to Newcastle. Almost to Newcastle. That is the magnitude of the shame, that is the magnitude of the economic problem that you have wrought on this country. And I think what you should do, and John Dawkins should do, is go along and talk to some of those people one by one. Look them in the eye, ask them about how your 18% interest rate drove them out of their homes, had to sell up their homes, or the farmers who were paying 25% interest rates were driven off their farm, or the small business people that have lost their business and their home. That's the price they've been asked to pay by your politically expedient policy making. People will never forgive.